It was just part of the game. I think the refs had a lot to do with that. It was a build-up for a couple of years now of them just not protecting, the star player of the WNBA. And so
It's like watching a split-screen comparison that gets more painful by the day. On one side, you have Caitlin Clark hitting impossible three-pointers and shattering attendance records, while redefining what marketability looks like in women's basketball. On the other side, you have Angel Reese fumbling golden opportunities while her fan base spirals into complete meltdown mode, desperately grasping for anything to justify the hype train that's clearly derailed. And speaking of painful statistics, here's one that should make every Sky fan cringe. Chicago is 15 wins and 31 losses when Angel Reese records a double-double. Let that sink in for a moment. They're over 15 games under 500 when she achieves the stat that everyone celebrates like she just won the championship. The embarrassment of popping champagne for a statistic that's directly tied to losing games is almost too much to handle. When reality started looking this unflattering, the Sky supporters retreated into their favorite defense mechanism: completely fabricated viewership numbers. WNBA Twitter transformed into a carnival of inflated statistics, with claims so outrageous they'd make you think the league was bigger than the NFL, Taylor Swift, and the moon landing combined. But dig just a little deeper, and you realize these record-breaking claims are built on quicksand. They're comparing niche cable time slots to primetime national broadcasts, or including every accidental stream, clip view, and random highlight scroll on Instagram as part of their inflated totals. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark doesn't need any creative accounting because her impact is undeniably real. ESPN isn't relocating games for entertainment. They're doing it because demand for Clark is so astronomically high that arenas literally cannot contain the crowds. This isn't manufactured hype or social media spin. It's measurable, tangible, verifiable impact that speaks for itself. The blame carousel started spinning so fast it was making heads turn. When blaming the coach didn't work, suddenly it was the teammate's fault. When that fell apart, it was the referees conspiring against Angel. When that seemed ridiculous, it was the broadcasters showing bias. Next up, apparently the planets weren't properly aligned, and Mercury was in retrograde. If there was an excuse out there that didn't involve Angel Reese taking personal responsibility, Sky fans are going to find it and ride it into the sunset. It's the sports equivalent of having your cake and eating it too, except the cake is burnt, and somehow it's the baker's fault, not the person who left it in the oven. Angel gets praised as a superstar when things go well. But the moment something goes wrong, she magically transforms into a helpless victim of circumstances beyond her control. The contradiction is giving people whiplash. Here's what makes this even more frustrating. Angel Reese is actually talented. She's not a fraud or a benchwarmer pretending to be special. She has size, hustle, and genuine basketball ability. But the endless spin and protective bubble her supporters have built around her is making her look worse than she actually is. Instead of letting her grow from criticism and learn from mistakes, they're treating her like she's made of glass and incapable of handling any accountability. The viewership manipulation reached comedy special levels of absurdity. Sky fans were screaming about record-breaking ratings, but the fine print always told a completely different story. Maybe it was the highest-rated game in a random time slot on an obscure cable network with zero competition. Or perhaps they were comparing current numbers to games from a decade ago when coverage was practically non-existent. These weren't headlines. They were trivia card statistics dressed up as achievements. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark's numbers need zero inflation or creative interpretation because they're crystal clear and impossible to ignore. ESPN doesn't move programming around for fun. They do it because genuine demand is so high that the impact is undeniable. Ticket resales spike. Broadcasts featuring Clark outdraw everything else in the league, and the results are measurable without any statistical gymnastics required. When the fake numbers inevitably collapsed under basic scrutiny, the final defense mechanism kicked in, universal bias conspiracy theories. Suddenly, it wasn't about performance or statistics anymore. According to this alternate reality, referees, media members, and broadcasters had all joined some secret alliance to make Angel Reese look bad, which is hilarious because nobody forced her to choke when it mattered most. Nobody told her to miss crucial shots or fumble important plays. That was all her doing. The truth is, all this noise and excuse making isn't protecting Angel Reese. It's actually making her look completely dependent and unable to stand on her own merits. If she's truly the superstar her supporters claim she is, then she shouldn't need fake numbers, conspiracy theories, or an endless parade of scapegoats to justify her position. Her game should be doing all the talking. That's exactly what makes Caitlin Clark so special. Her performance is shouting from the rooftops, while others are whispering excuses in the shadows. She's not just living up to the hype. She's surpassing it with every deep three-pointer, every sold-out arena, and every rating spike attached to her name. It all adds up to something real and undeniable. The reality is simple and impossible to ignore. One player looks like the future of women's basketball, while the other looks like she's just trying not to trip over her own feet. It's like watching someone run a sprint with ankle weights while their competitor has rocket boosters strapped to their back. The numbers don't lie, the scoreboard doesn't lie, and highlight reels definitely don't lie. At the end of the day, you can dress up the narrative however you want, but the truth always surfaces. Caitlin Clark is dominating the league, and Angel Reese is struggling to keep pace. And now, with team insiders finally speaking up about her being voted the worst performer on the roster, maybe it's time for everyone to stop making excuses and start facing reality. Social media exploded instantly. Fans who had been watching couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Videos of the incident went viral within minutes, with frame-by-frame breakdowns showing just how obvious and violent the elbow had been. But this wasn't just about one bad call. This was the culmination of a pattern that had been building for months, and Sophie Cunningham had finally reached her breaking point. The aftermath revealed something that should have been shocking, but somehow wasn't surprising at all. This kind of officiating inconsistency had been plaguing Indiana all season long. Time and time again, Fever players found themselves on the wrong end of questionable calls. They would absorb contact that would have drawn flagrant fouls for other teams, only to watch the whistles stay silent. Meanwhile, the slightest touch on their opponents would result in technical fouls and ejections. But Sophie Cunningham wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. In the post-game press conference, she delivered what can only be described as a masterclass in controlled fury. Her words were measured but devastating, cutting through the usual diplomatic language that players are expected to use when criticizing officiating. She spoke about a pattern of neglect, about star players not being protected, about a system that seemed designed to favor certain teams and certain players over others. Her revelation was jaw-dropping, not just for its content, but for its timing. This was a player fighting through her own injuries, playing for a team barely holding together, choosing to risk everything by speaking truth to power. She could have taken the safe route, mumbled something about officials doing their best, and moved on. Instead, she chose to expose what she saw as systematic corruption that was undermining the integrity of the game. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Other players began speaking out, sharing their own experiences with questionable officiating. Coaches who had bitten their tongues for years started asking pointed questions about accountability and consistency. Fans launched social media campaigns demanding transparency and reform. The league office, which had grown comfortable operating in the shadows, suddenly found itself under an uncomfortable spotlight. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire saga was what happened on the court. Despite everything, despite the injuries and the controversial calls and the constant uphill battle, the Indiana Fever refused to break. They channeled their frustration into fuel, their anger into energy, and their desperation into determination. Kelsey Mitchell continued her superhuman performances, averaging numbers that seemed impossible for someone carrying such a heavy load. Aaliyah Boston dominated the paint night after night, absorbing punishment that would have sent lesser players to the bench while still finding ways to impact winning. And when Sophie Cunningham returned from her injury, she played with a fire that seemed to burn brighter than ever before. Her comeback became the stuff of legend. 16 points off the bench in her first game back, followed by a 23-point explosion that reminded everyone why she was considered one of the most valuable role players in the league. But these weren't just scoring performances, they were statements. Every made shot felt like a middle finger to the officials who had failed to protect her. Every defensive stop was a declaration that she wouldn't be intimidated or silenced. The timing couldn't have been more perfect because Indiana was about to get their biggest reinforcement of all. Caitlin Clark, the rookie who had taken the basketball world by storm before her injury, was finally spotted on practice courts. Videos of her moving freely, handling the ball, and engaging with teammates sent shockwaves through the WNBA community. After weeks of uncertainty, the cavalry was finally arriving. Clark's impending return added another layer to the story that Sophie Cunningham had started. Here was a player who had brought unprecedented attention and revenue to the league, someone who had filled arenas and driven television ratings to heights never before seen in women's basketball. If the officiating inconsistencies that plagued other Indiana players extended to Clark, if the league's biggest star wasn't protected, the ramifications could be catastrophic. The playoff implications made everything even more dramatic. Indiana sat at 19-18 with just 7 games remaining in the regular season, clinging to the 8th and final playoff spot by their fingernails. Every possession mattered, every call could determine their fate, and every game felt like a referendum on their entire season. The margin for error had disappeared entirely, and yet they kept finding ways to survive. Their remaining schedule read like a murderer's row of championship contenders. Seattle, Golden State, Chicago, Los Angeles. These weren't teams you could afford to have bad nights against, and certainly not teams you could beat if the officials were working against you. But Indiana had something that couldn't be measured in stats or rankings. They had the kind of righteous anger that can move mountains. As Sophie Cunningham participated in more shoot-around sessions, and Coach Stephanie White offered increasingly optimistic updates about her star players' progress, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about the possibility of something magical. A team that had been written off, that had fought through adversity that would have broken lesser squads, was on the verge of making a statement that would resonate far beyond basketball. The transformation was already visible in practice footage. Sophie moved with the kind of confidence and purpose that suggested she was ready to carry whatever burden the team needed her to bear. Her presence stretched defenses, created cleaner looks for her teammates, and turned chaotic possessions into coordinated attacks. She wasn't just another player returning from injury. She was the missing piece that could turn a good story into an unforgettable one. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Would the league respond to the controversy that Sophie Cunningham had unleashed? Would officials suddenly start protecting players who had been left vulnerable for too long? Or would the system that had failed so spectacularly continue to operate in the shadows, hoping that the spotlight would eventually fade and business could continue as usual? The answer would come in the crucible of playoff basketball, where every call is magnified and every mistake is immortalized. Sophie Cunningham had thrown down the gauntlet, exposing what she believed to be corruption at the highest levels of women's professional basketball. Now the entire sports world would be watching to see if her courage would be rewarded, or if the system would find new ways to silence those who dared to speak truth to power. One thing was certain: the Indiana Fever's fight for survival had become something much bigger than basketball. It had become a battle for the soul of the WNBA itself.